Grüezi Amerika, Views from the Sister Republic, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Claudia Brüwiler. Grüezi miteinander, and welcome to a new episode of Views from the Sister Republic. It's November 10, 1865. Heinrich Henry Wirz is executed as only one of three men tried, convicted, and executed for war crimes during the Civil War. Henry Wirz, a Swiss who had fought for the Confederacy. As captain, he had been in charge of Andersonville Prison in Georgia, and he would be held responsible for the dire conditions under which Union soldiers were held there. How did Wirz, born in Zurich, end up commanding Andersonville? And was he a mere scapegoat or indeed the monster he was made out to be? Unfortunately, there's very little literature about this particular Swiss in America, and very few people actually know about his story in Switzerland. But I was lucky to find one of the few who wrote a scholarly book on Andersonville Prison, and that is Dr. Ben Cloyd. Thank you for making time for Grüezi Amerika, Dr. Cloyd.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much, Claudia. I'm glad to be here with you today.
So, Ben, you're currently serving as Vice President of Enrollment Management at Mississippi Delta Community College in the state of Mississippi. But earlier you studied history at one of my favorite universities. You're a Domer. You went to University of Notre Dame, and then you went on to study at Louisiana State University, where you eventually obtained a PhD in history. And your doctoral thesis ended up being published as a book titled Haunted by Atrocity: Civil War Prisons in American Memory. And one of the Civil War prisons that you wrote about extensively in the book is Andersonville. What was Andersonville, and why is it one of the prisons whose names are still haunting American memory?
Well, again, it's a pleasure to be here with you today. When it comes to Andersonville, I would say this. The Civil War, of course, in America was unlike anything that was seen prior to or even since. You know, obviously, the United States has been through significant conflicts in the last 150 to 200 years. But the Civil War stands alone. And of course, as a fratricidal conflict, that's easy to see. But I think the real kind of challenge or the real meaning of Andersonville was that in the midst of an incredibly brutal and destructive conflict, what Andersonville and the Civil War prisons and the experience that prisoners of war in the conflicts, the experience of the hands in both the Union and the Confederacy, was really unlike anything that they could have expected prior to the conflict itself. You were much safer on the battle lines as a Union or Confederate soldier than you were if you were captured and held in a detainment facility in either the North or the South. And among the many prison camps of the North and South, Andersonville was kind of, or stood out, I would say, because it was one of the largest at its peak. It held over 40,000. And it was also the worst in terms of the number of how many ultimately soldiers from the Union died in the Georgia area at Andersonville, with 13,000 perishing. So in terms of scope and scale, and in terms of the numbers that did not make it back from captivity at Andersonville, it was the largest. And because of its size and because of its scope, it became a focal point for a lot of the, I would say, retributions, trying to understand what had happened and why it had happened. And it became kind of the epicenter of what I would say is an ongoing sort of memory conflict that has really challenged Americans ever since. And that has evolved over the last 150 plus years. It's a place that is a place of great suffering. It's a place that is also essential to understand why the suffering of the Civil War happened in general. And that, of course, is the connection to the conflict over slavery and the meaning of freedom in the United States, as the whole Civil War was about. And so because these things cannot be easily disentangled, And because these men died in ways that were not traditionally seen as heroic, this was not a battlefield charge or making a last stand, when you're down to your last bullet. This was simply sitting in miserable conditions with a lack of food, a lack of shelter, getting sick, unclean water. Yes, additional, there can be brutality and among the inmates themselves, the captives themselves, as well as their guards. And so it's just not a glorious. It's not a glorious way to die, and it's also a way that spotlights why the war was even fought to begin with. And so it's been very difficult for Americans ever since to come to terms with, I would think, and fully understand why Andersonville does continue to matter so much as it does, I would say, in our culture today. And so after the war itself, I'll just kind of bring back around to why Andersonville became kind of the spotlight. So when the war was over, as Union forces moved through the area, the captain of the prison, Henry Wirz, was arrested and brought to Washington, D.C. A few months later, he was tried and executed for war crimes. Eventually, the prison grounds themselves became tended to by a group called the Women's Relief Corps, and that eventually led to the creation of Andersonville National Cemetery. Ultimately, where the grounds became Andersonville National Historic Site in 1970. And so of all the Civil War prison facilities, it's really the only one that has been preserved and carefully kind of tended to. And so it's become kind of, I would say, ground zero or the epicenter for the memory of Civil War prisons in general. So Andersonville not only serves for itself, but it also serves as a stand-in for all the other Civil War prison facilities. And it's also become sort of the center of the way of where the United States thinks about what it means to be a prisoner of war in general. And so it's very layered in terms of why that site, why that spot. But it goes back to that it was the biggest and deadliest of all the prison war camps, North and South, during the Civil War.
So I'd like to dial back and go back to what actually happened at Andersonville, because you mentioned early on, and this was really striking, that it was much more dangerous for soldiers to be held in captivity, and that the likelihood of dying in captivity was much higher than actually at the front lines. So was it mainly because of hygiene and just the knowledge about how diseases spread, etc., or was there also malevolence on the side of those who were in charge of, for instance, Andersonville, that made these prison camps so deadly?
So looking back on it, of course, from today, it's a little easier to see since we're not in the kind of haze and the emotion of the moment. Yes, there's a reason why armies did better when they were on the move, health-wise, than when they stopped and stayed in one place. Because especially in those days, pre-modern sanitation and the like, yes, hygiene and disease are by far the major killers among soldiers who are in captive or who are being held captive. And so that's very clearly the leading cause. Having said that, you can also go back and look at the way the prison systems themselves came to be. When the Civil War started, there was a much more, I guess it was just a more informal time, and the scope of the Civil War was not clear as the war began. So there really wasn't any preparation made for holding large groups of people in ways like this. When the Civil War began, there were traditional exchange kind of on the battlefield, immediate exchange after a battle or a parole where you swear an oath. But the idea of mass detainment was not a concept that Americans were really well versed in or had deep familiarity with. Of course, there was a little bit during the American Revolution, but nothing on this scale or scope. And so basically the bottom line is the Confederacy did not prepare for this. To be fair, it took the Union a long time to prepare for it as well. I don't think preparation for prisoners of war was a priority really on either side because it wasn't what the war was fought for. That nobody goes to fight a war to say, how can we best take care of our prisoners of war? I think that's probably not something that's in human nature. But to call it malevolence, I think anytime you have human beings in close proximity with one another, you're going to have incidents and episodes of malevolence, as you put it. But that's not the widespread cause of why so many soldiers died. Ultimately, the reason why so many soldiers died is because the prisons existed, because there were fundamental questions in the war itself that could not be answered. And so the prisoners, to my point of view or my way of thinking, are essentially placeholders for the larger issues of why the war is being fought itself. The Lincoln administration and Davis administration are looking at the conflict from legal terms. What is sovereignty? What is rebellion? How to ensure that both the Union and Confederacy could best use their position to advantage to gain international support as they wage their wars. And then as the war became more and more explicitly about slavery and the Lincoln administration, focusing on emancipation as a key component of that, and the Confederacy refusing to recognize that African American soldiers, Black soldiers who fought for the Union had the same rights, then the idea of the ability to exchange prisoners became undoable. So basically, you went from a kind of an informal system of exchange to a cartel that existed during the middle of the war. But as the war itself evolved and it became clear this was a war of destruction and also of racial meaning, that the prisons had to exist. And because they had to exist, and because they existed in the way they did, and because disease was inevitable in those settings, combined, as I said, with other factors, that's where the brutality or the mortality, I would say, came from.
When I read about Henry Wirz, who was then in charge of Andersonville and in some ways not in charge too, as he would reason, I was struck by the fact that he had hardly any experience as a soldier, let alone as someone who would then have to manage a detainment facility. How did a captain like him end up being chosen for such an onerous task?
So again, as I said, I'm no expert biographer of Wirz, so I can't speak, deeply on all his, life experience and what led him to that point. I know he had a bit of a checkered past coming from Switzerland, and when he came, he had been in Massachusetts before moving south. And when the war came, he was in Richmond, and of course, in Richmond, in the early days of the war, that's where most of the prisoner of war traffic that the Confederacy held when they captured Union soldiers flowed through Richmond. So a lot of the prisons, of course, were there in Richmond. So Wirz did gain experience in the prisoner of war setting in the early years of the war, because of his service in Richmond. When the Confederacy realized that it needed to take some of the pressure off the city of Richmond, that things were becoming untenable, and began to look elsewhere in 1864 to Georgia, to Andersonville, because Wirz had that background of familiarity, he was chosen for that position. And so I think, to your point, it does speak to, I think, the Confederacy's, to the stress that had been placed on the Confederacy by that point in time, that this was a region that, in entering rebellion, in being, undermanned and outgunned, and however you want to phrase it, you do run out of capable servants. I'm not suggesting that, anybody would have been, I'm not suggesting anybody would have thrived in the task of managing Andersonville. I think that was really an impossible set of circumstances. But I think it is fair to point out, as you do, that unless you have somebody who's really able, that when you put somebody in charge of a set of circumstances that really are harrowing, good things are not going to happen.
Now, how do we have to imagine the day-to-day life in a prison like Andersonville, where the soldiers just held captive, or were they put to work? What did their life in confinement look like?
Sure, I think it varied. Many were kind of ill and sick and could not be of much service. But essentially, at Andersonville, and each prison camp is different. And so I think besides just Andersonville, some camps had barracks, some camps were open air. And so I think it's important to note that Andersonville was a little bit different, that it was an open air stockade. So it was just acres and acres of open ground, a stream kind of running through the bottom of the fenced in area. And essentially, as folks came in, they kind of organized themselves. If you found comrades or from the same regiment, things like that, you would sort of cluster with people you knew from your area, from your state. But it was very haphazard at Andersonville. And so the idea of kind of discipline and organization was tenuous at best. But yeah, each day sort of consisted of obtaining whatever rations were available. There were certainly some work details that took place as well from some of the prisoners, but essentially it was kind of open air, hot in the summer, cold in the winter, very much very little rations, being in an environment where the only source of water was both or the water served as both source of water and also as the latrine area, so it became very unhealthy very, very quickly.
Was there any chance for prisoners to be released, or did everyone have to wait until the liberation?
As I mentioned, there was a cartel called the Dix Hill Cartel that stopped functioning in 1863, and that was due to the fact that by 1863, due to policy choices by the Lincoln administration and Davis administration, the issue of what to do, especially with black soldiers, had become a real sticking point. There are other factors as well. The ability to supply and feed prisoners was certainly part of the calculus, as was the calculus of what's the fastest way to ending the war. And so I'm not suggesting that the Lincoln and Davis administrations were only focused on racial implications, but I think if you look back at the core issue that caused the breakdown of the cartel, it is undeniably and unmistakably the fact that as the war became openly, from Lincoln's position, about securing and protecting the rights of Black Americans, then the Confederacy's decision to embark upon what was called essentially the Black Flag, which meant no quarter and no treatment given, no equal treatment given to Black captives, that meant that cartel broke down. So the cartel broke down, as I said, for a variety of reasons, political and racial. And so from that moment on, then that's the same moment that in 1864 the war got bigger and bloodier and more destructive. That was a year of real attrition. And so thousands and thousands of soldiers accumulated very quickly, which is why Andersonville even existed in the first place. It was a place that was created out of a need to suddenly house a growing number of people in circumstances that were not well prepared for.
Do we know how many of the captives held in Andersonville were Black soldiers?
There are some. I don't have a good count, in front of me. Like I said, when I wrote my book, I really didn't write it as a day-to-day account of the prison. There are certainly books that would give you a better count or would kind of go through. So that was never a focal point for me. There were some Black soldiers there, but not many. So it was fairly rare, just on the scale of the overall numbers, as the 45,000 who were held there. So it did happen, but it was not a primary experience in terms of what most experienced.
So Henry Wirz argued that although he was formally in charge, at the end of the day, he was only obeying orders, and that he was under the command of Brigadier General John Winder. So what was the role of Brigadier General John Winder for the prison system of the Confederacy?
Listen, Winder, like Wirz, had been in Richmond and was, part of the early days of the, Confederacy's efforts to care for prisoners of war as best it could. And so as the need for that structure evolved, Winder took on more and more of that authority. And ultimately, when the decision was made, to kind of relocate the center of holding prisoners of war for the Confederacy to Andersonville, Winder actually went on site as well. And so I think that's where some of Wirz's, I would say, maybe frustrations are stemming from. He's got his supervisor there on site with him. If you go back and you read the orders and dispatches that Wirz wrote that are in the the general records of the Civil War, you'll see that he's kind of frequently complaining about things he can do and can't do. And so I think to take it from a very different perspective, I think all of us are used to having supervisors and used to having, and what that means. And when they're in close proximity, it means, sometimes that things don't run like you would want them to run. But having said all that, because Andersonville came about quickly, and because Andersonville came about in a way that quickly dwarfed what was expected, it would have required, as I said, in tremendous ability and tremendous proactivity, I would say, in order to really take efforts to alleviate the situation as quickly as it was developing. And I think what you see in Wirz is somebody that I think ultimately failed in an impossible task. If that makes sense, and so it doesn't mean that he was far from perfect. Doesn't mean that he wasn't capable of moments of great cruelty and even personal, cruelty. But those things aren't why 13,000 people died. The reason why those 13,000 people died again goes back to the fact that they were being held because of the policy choices as to why the war is being fought in the first place.
Now, how much did people in the North, in the Union, know about the conditions in the different prisons and in Anderson specifically during the war? Because later it would become a huge topic, as you describe in your book. But how much did they know during the war?
It became a huge topic during the war. I think what's interesting to me, especially when I was doing my research, was that it wasn't like people just started arguing about this 10 or 15 years later. They were 10 or 15 years later, and then even past that. But the argument began during the war itself. There was a real frustration. Prisoners wrote diaries. There were newspaper accounts published. And again, both the Union and Confederacy really banged the drum to say, we are doing the best we can to care for our prisoners, but the other side is doing this on purpose. And so there was a real demonization on both sides towards each other. That was very, very clear. And that makes sense. That makes sense that there was that demonization. It's part of, morale and propaganda and supporting a war cause. And so, yes, there was a real knowledge. There was a group from Andersonville that was released to travel to the North to give their testimony as to what was going on so that people could understand. And so, no, it was widely known. And by the end of the war, as I said, there's a reason why that animosity focused on Andersonville and on Wirz in particular, because for the North, Andersonville is a real symbol of Southern inhumanity, the Confederate brutality. And again, especially when these deaths, 13,000 and 56,000 prisoners of war and all died in the Civil War. And that's a huge percentage of the people that died in the Civil War in ways that, aren't really easily defensible. And so it became very, very publicized, very well known, and the hostility was very deep. I think it was also very nuanced as well during the war, though. When you read the diaries of Union prisoners of war, they definitely point the finger at Wirz, and they point the finger at the Davis administration and all those things. But they also point the finger at the Union government, say, why aren't we being exchanged? Why can't we get out of here? Why is this? And so there is a real complexity to the arguments, even though the easiest default is that kind of sectional pointing at one another of, it's your fault, no, it's your fault, no, it's your fault. But the prisoners themselves understood that they were basically pawns in a much larger conflict that could not really be resolved until the conflict itself was resolved.
Well, at the end, it was Wirz who had to stand trial for what had happened in Andersonville. Why didn't we see any of his superiors end up being convicted, being tried even?
Well, Winder was, to me, probably the most logical target along with Wirz, but he had died of a heart attack prior to the end of the war. And so he was not available to face the music, so to speak. And that created, I think, that added to the convenience, I would say, of the focus on Wirz. And because to go above Winder, now you're talking about Confederate administration, Jefferson Davis and his cabinet officials. And so that becomes a very thorny political problem in a country that is trying to figure out what reconciliation, recovery, reconstruction, what all this looks like in the post-war environment. To bring it back to Wirz, the Wirz was a convenient target because he was in command of this place. This place had seen an incredible tragedy unfold very quickly and at great scope and cost of life. It had generated great emotion and great publicity across the North. There was a real outrage in the North. What I write about it, to me, there's a real sense of Northern virtue. The idea that it wasn't enough just to win the war, but to win the war, this was a war that proved the Northern superiority and virtue over the Confederacy. And so when you are in an environment where there's lots of rhetoric about how much better you are and how virtuous you are, well, that requires something or somebody to be virtuous over. And again, Wirz certainly fit the bill on that level as well. Because he was, relatively middle management, because he had no real defenders or real defense. I mean, there's really nothing you can say that would look at Anderson and go, yeah, that went well. It didn't. It was a terrible place among a lot of terrible places, but it was the most terrible of them all. And because he was sort of in the middle and without a strong political support or political backing, I think, again, you're in a country where there is a strong anti-immigrant nativist bent. I think some things maybe don't change. But I think that was part of the ambiance of the time. Back in the 1850s, there was a very strong anti-immigrant political movement, of course, the Know Nothing movement. And so I think when you look at all those factors and the anger at the end of the war in the North, and there was a real anger in the North about what had happened, and also a real, I would say, incomplete understanding of what had happened. And I think when you have an anger and an incomplete understanding of what had happened, it's easy to demonize. It's easy to really lay blame in a simplistic way. And I think that's what ultimately was Wirz's fate. He was a simplistic answer to a terrible situation that was part of a larger terrible situation of the Civil War prisons themselves, and sort of a larger terrible situation as the Civil War itself. And that's what doomed him to his execution.
So you have mentioned in passing also nativism as an issue. So the fact that he was not born in the US, probably had a heavy accent when he spoke, at least that's what we gather from the source material, might have made it easier to convict him as well, as he wasn't part of the fratricidal war in the narrowest sense of the word.
No, I think there's something to that. I mean, he's certainly not part of the inner circle of the Confederate leadership. And then again, that foreign status, which is emphasized in prisoner accounts and all the rest of that, again, that when you're talking about an evil, by nature, I think a lot of times we as human beings would often define evil as something foreign. And so I think there is definitely a connection that can be made there. I think that is, a fair judgment. Again, the problem with, absolving Wirz or saying, it wasn't his fault is too far to me. I mean, he was on site at a place where people basically baked to death, were shot, starved to death, horrible things happen. And so it is to call anybody in those circumstances innocent or undeserving or whatever, I think is, again, a little too simplistic on either side, but I think it is fair to Wirz to say it was a bit of a perfect storm as to why the anger and the backlash focused on him. Certainly his identity, certainly his lack of elevated status in the Confederate government, all those things contributed to what happened with his execution for sure.
What is interesting is that he remained a contested figure even beyond his execution, that there was even in the early 20th century a monument dedicated to him in his honor by the United Daughters of the Confederacy. How come that his memory would really outlast his life and would become so contested, really?
Well, to me, this was kind of why I wrote the book. Lots of people have written about Civil War prisons, but the way I really approach it is a bit different. I've been much more interested in why we keep coming back to these terrible events in the decades and different generations that follow. And to me, that's really, in a lot of ways, one of the most important stories of the whole, or one of the most important aspects of why Civil War prisons and Andersonville matter so much. So in a nutshell, what happened after the immediate bitterness and recrimination was that both sides, for several decades, sort of engaged in an ongoing rhetorical memory war. You had Union POWs and Confederate POWs that would write memoirs and publish articles and, kind of bet, no, you were worse, and that sort of thing. And that went on for a long time, which makes sense. These are men whose lives have been shattered and broken by their experiences, and their identities were very much tied up with what had happened to them in those terrible days in the 1860s. And so it's easy to understand and has, I think, some sympathy for why those passions would be so hardened. What's interesting is, as those men reach the end of their lives, I think with every generation, we see sort of an outpouring of what did it all mean? The United States, we recently went through the greatest generation, the World War II veterans and their passing. And that brought a wave of, Tom Hanks TV shows and all these things, where we really wanted to say thank you to the men who had served in World War II. Right? And I think you see that in the Civil War at the turn of the late 1800s, early 1900s, is you see this wave of monuments, of, kind of gatherings. And it's an attempt to sort of, I think, sort of codify in marble and stone and plaques and tablets what had happened, 30 or 40 or 50 years previously. So what happened in Andersonville basically became a contested landscape as you had sort of first northern monuments being built. New Jersey built it in 1898, and then other northern states followed. And as the northern states started building their monuments to their prisoners who had died there, the southern counter response to the United Daughters of the Confederacy was, well, if y'all are going to come down here and tell us what happened, what about the other side of the story? And that's where the funding for the Wirz Monument came at Andersonville. Again, it's this kind of memory of Northern virtue versus this kind of deflective counter memory on the Southern side of, which side was worse, who did this on purpose. It's the same kind of ongoing war that had been fought on the battlefield 50 years earlier. It's still being fought. And now it's just being fought through words and through monuments. I think that the fascinating thing to me in all of that is that battle still ignores the same issue which was ignored in the war itself. Why this happened, again, goes back to the emancipationist meaning of freedom in the war that caused the prisons and the cartel to break down to begin with. That's being overshadowed once again in all of this. And so I think the memories and the monuments that are built very clearly serve sectional needs, and the need in the North to remember the war is worth it, as well as the need for many white Southerners that we did the best we could, even though we lost. And so I think that's where you see those monuments come from in the early 1900s.
Now, there are other places of memory as well beyond the actual space where the prison stood, namely novels and plays in which Wirz is immemorialized. I stumbled upon Saul Levitt's 1960 play, The Andersonville Trial, where we don't really learn much about Wirz as a character, but we learn a lot about the accusations. And then there is, of course, the Pulitzer Prize winning novel by McKinley Cantor called Andersonville. For you as a historian, how true to history are these fictionalized renditions of the history of Andersonville?
I don't think they're very useful from a historical perspective. If you're looking for, factual retellings of what transpired, what they are absolutely essential, though, is for understanding what Andersonville meant to people a century later. And so what happened after that whole monument building back and forth I mentioned a minute ago was, by the time you get to the 1940s and 50s and 60s, following World War I and World War II and the global conflicts of the 20th century, that really put Civil War prisons kind of into context for Americans. All of a sudden, the demon of Andersonville was Henry Wirz. Yes, these are still terrible circumstances, but when you place them alongside what happened in the World Wars, they start to become a little less unique and sadly a little bit more sort of universal in terms of human experience. And so what you really see in Andersonville by Cantor and the Andersonville Trial by Levitt is a recognition that what happened in Andersonville in the Civil War was really more of a universal human experience that is more tied to the nature of war, the nature of modern war. And so what it does is it, in essence, it sort of sanitizes the peculiarities of the past. Again, I would argue it minimizes and takes out the most important part of the story of the Civil War, which is the racial component and what that reckoning with that legacy means for our country. But it does so in a way to try to put Andersonville in the context of modern war itself. And so it's really not about the accuracy of the facts as much as it is the meaning of why it is that we need to look at atrocity. What does it mean for us? How can we better understand it? And also, these are commercial products. How can we also sell it at the same time? And I think there's a very much a commercial aspect to memory that's part of why Civil War prisons remain a viable topic of discussion, because there's enough interest in them to sell product and attract tourists and that sort of thing as well.
A commercial interest in memory. That's an interesting last angle that you're touching here on.
Well, not in terms of my book sales, not in terms of my book.
Well, you never know. You never know.
Oh, no, it's fine.
So thank you so much, Ben, for taking us to Andersonville, a place that is haunted and that is still haunting American memory. For someone who has specialized on Civil War history, what would you say is for you the best book to start studying the era for those of our listeners who would now like to learn more about the history of the Civil War?
If you want to read one book on the Civil War, I would recommend a book called The Destructive War by Charles Royster. Dr. Royster, it's called The Destructive War by Charles Royster. And I think what Dr. Royster did is capture the essence of the intensity of the conflicts and how it pulled the country apart in a way that I don't think many historians have been able to do. I think there's lots of space and it's important to focus on the issues, but that book to me is a singular achievement.
Thank you so much for the recommendation. It might be some New Year's reading for our listeners here in Switzerland. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
We will end this episode with the words of Henry Wirz himself. The Evening Star published on its front page a long report about his last moments, and it also let his voice be heard. So the Evening Star writes, with respect to his fate, Henry Wirz said, and I quote, "As far as I am concerned, I have no hope of reprieve. These things which were done, meaning Andersonville, somebody must suffer for. I have never denied that the prisoners were mistreated, but it was not my fault. If I am the last one that is to suffer death for the Southern Confederacy, I am satisfied. I do not fear death. I never saw a man shot, nor never shot one myself. That I will say as long as I can say it. I never hunted prisoners with dogs, nor anything of that kind. Unfortunately, General Winder is dead. If he was living, I know he would come out and not let the innocent ones suffer." And then he ends with, "I went down into the yard today and there saw preparations being made for the scaffold, which would make most any man flinch. I had no such feelings. I cannot express it. It is not hard-heartedness, but I had no such feelings." And with that, dear listeners, I wish you auf Wiederhören and thank you for listening to the story of Henry Wirz and Andersonville.
Grüezi Amerika, Views from the Sister Republic, a University of St. Gallen podcast by Claudia Brühwiler.